It's exactly 10 minutes past 3 p.m. In Uganda, and I want to welcome you all to this webinar. My name is Nachibuka Noromosisi. I'm coming in from the Center for Health, Human Rights and Development. I'm excited to have you all here for this regional webinar that looks at the African-centered approaches towards decolonizing sexual reproductive health and rights. So we'll have a conversation for about 2 hours, and I want to tell you that I have speakers, but very knowledgeable in the area. Introduce to you our speakers for the day. We'll have the keynote address being given by Professor Charles Ngwena. Professor Charles Ngwena is a professor of law at the Faculty of Law at the University of Pretoria. And his paper will be discussed by 3 respondents, one of whom is Dr. Mildred Mushunje, and Dr. Mildred is a country director of the Srhr Africa Trust in Zimbabwe. We'll also have Ms. Nelly Munyasya, who is the executive director of Reproductive Health Network Kenya. And then we'll have Mr. Romy Mom, who is the President Lawyers Alert in Nigeria. So allow me call upon Professor Ngwena to start us off with a keynote address. So Professor Ngwena will really discuss for us a paper that he has developed in collaboration with Afya and Haki, and the paper looks at decolonizing sexual reproductive health and human rights, laying a foundation for an African-centered approach. So one would want to know, what is this whole issue of decolonizing Srhr? And what is this whole issue of taking forward an African-centered approach? You have all the answers from the paper that Professor Ngwena will be discussing with us tonight. Over to you, Professor Ngwena. Professor Ngwena?
Thank you very much for the kind invitation to speak to my paper. As with all papers, I would really like to begin by a very modest claim that the paper is not about decolonizing sexual and reproductive health and human rights, but rather it is about laying a foundation. And let me begin by explaining what that foundation is. The foundation presupposes that law and policy are implicated in the manner in which the nation state, but as well as the global entity, intersects with sexual and reproductive health and rights. So my interest was in developing a normative approach which could guide policy and law in order to ensure that Africans are put at the center of law and policy making as it applies to sexual and reproductive health and rights. And I'm thinking that the constituencies that this paper impacts on will be policymakers, those that are in government or in outside government are involved in making law and policy. Legislatures are also an important part of the constituencies. So are courts, because ultimately they are involved in the interpretation and application of our laws. So my interest is in raising consciousness about our colonial past and also our colonial present, and to see how the past and the present are entangled in the ways that impact on Africans as they try to protect, to fulfill, and to realize their sexual and reproductive health and rights. So I'm not going to be repeating the paper, but I would like to speak to some of the key operational concepts in the paper, and I can summarize them as 5 main components. One is coloniality. The other is decolonization. And third is inclusive equality. And fourth are human rights. And the last one is intersectionality. And these are not in any order of priority. What I want to say about coloniality is really to repeat what Professor Sylvia Tamale, the Ugandan feminist, has said in her book, Afrofeminism and Decolonization. She says, decolonization entails the task of, in quote, dismantling several layers of complex and entrenched colonial structures, ideologies, narratives, identities, and practices that pervade every aspect of our lives. And I think the point that comes through is that we cannot really look at a single structure when we think about coloniality. Coloniality itself is a term that was coined initially by scholars in the Latin American region. And what they wanted to highlight was that coloniality is something not quite the same as colonialism itself. Even though it springs from colonialism, we should understand it as a system of power that has survived formal decolonization. In other words, the point that was being made is that we should be conscious of the persistence of colonialism even after flag independence. As we all know, most of Africa, but though not all of it, became independent in the 60s. And yet, if we look closely at our nation states, if we look closely at the way that our nation states engage with their former colonial masters, so to speak, we see many signs that the relationship that was formerly decolonized survives. And that was really the point about coloniality. It was to conceptualize the survival of colonialism after flag independence. So clearly, we don't need to persuade ourselves that decolonization is an imperative. If we are to assert ourselves, if we are to protect our sense of being independent, then certainly we need to dismantle, as Professor Tamale says, those layers of complex and entrenched colonial structures, ideologies, narratives, identities, and practices that affect our everyday lives. So my point is that conceptualizing coloniality is a starting point. We need to know what this concept entails. Then we need to know how to respond to it. And we are saying that decolonization is a way of responding, but we need to ask ourselves what decolonization entails. So I'm going to make 4 points about decolonization, which I extract from the paper. The first point I make is that when we think of decolonization, certainly we need to be historically conscious, because it is a theory that we construct at the back of a long history of debate about and resistance against colonialism. The second point is that when we think about decolonization, important as it is and necessary as it is to look to the past, we should also be attentive to the present, because societies are always in a state of transformation. Equally, we should remain open to democratic iteration. Decolonization is not something we do outside our democratic governance, assuming we have consented to that democratic governance. We are saying that decolonization does not stand outside those democratic processes. We should guard against a fundamentalist approach to decolonization, for the reason that if we become too fundamentalist about what decolonization is, we are in danger of constituting the very colonial power that we wish to contest. The third point I make about decolonization is that we should accept that whether we are Ugandans or Nigerians or Zimbabweans or Malawians, we are always a diverse society. There is not one part of our cultures that speaks for everyone. So as we think about decolonization, we should allow multiple understandings of decolonization to emerge. Equally, we should allow multiple subjectivities. And I will elaborate on that when I make the fourth point, which is that when we look at colonial practices in Africa, in Asia, in the Caribbean, in the Middle East, and in the Americas, we see points of similarities. Equally, we see points of differences. And I will emphasize that point by also saying, even within Africa, no two colonialisms are the same. Certainly, we see axes of similarities, but equally, we should be conscious of the differences so that in formulating our decolonial approach, we do so being alive to nuance and differences. And this is important for law and policy making. I wish now to speak about inclusive equality, because I regard it as an important dimension of any decolonial theory. So what do I mean by inclusive equality? So here, I should say that the paper borrowed very much from the approach of the Committee on the Rights of Persons of Disabilities in formulating its thinking about inclusive equality. I was persuaded by general comment number 6 on equality, and non-discrimination, in particular paragraph 11 of that general comment in conceptualizing inclusive equality. We can think of inclusive equality as made up of 4 dimensions. One dimension is what we can describe as a recognition dimension. And in other words, we are saying that any policy, law, or practice on sexual and reproductive health and rights must have the capacity to recognize persons as persons in order to combat stigma, stereotyping, prejudice, and violence. Because if we cannot recognize persons as persons, it risks violating the human dignity of those persons. And inevitably, recognizing that all persons have human dignity requires you to be attentive to intersectionalities, a concept that I will speak to a little bit later. The second component is equally important. You need a participatory dimension. And participation speaks to itself, especially when we are engaging with colonialism, because colonialism was an enterprise that sought to possess a territory, convert the territory and its people into property without their consent, without their participation. So the point we are making is that any decolonial approach should be committed to inclusive equality, including recognizing the right to participation. It's important to reaffirm the social nature of people as members of social groups with choices that need to be recognized as part of the construction of an inclusive society. The third point is an accommodation dimension. It's really linked equally to participation, but it's slightly different, or has a different emphasis. Accommodation is about making space for difference as a consequence of recognizing diversity of human beings. So we ask the question, if we look at how the nation states thinks about non-discrimination, if we look at how the nation states thinks about equality, we want to be assured that it accommodates the diversity of human beings, because human beings are similar and yet they are also different. Each of us is unique in their own way. And if we look at society, we see social stratifications, we see social groups, and very often there is stratification of social groups. There is a hierarchical organization of social groups, meaning they don't always have the same interest. And we want to develop a theory that has the capacity to accommodate diversity of human beings in a manner which is not hierarchical. The fourth point is an economic dimension, meaning that if we take sexual and reproductive health and rights seriously, we need to also acknowledge that economic accessibility can become a barrier. So there ought to be, as the fourth element, a fair redistributive dimension to address socio-economic disadvantages in order to ensure that there is a playing field, a level playing field. Now, I want to speak a little bit now about human rights, the concept of human rights, which we are all familiar, to remind us that while human rights are extremely important in order to check abuse of power of the nation state, nonetheless, we need to be conscious that at their inception, at their beginnings, they were not intended necessarily to promote the lives of people in the global south. If they were, it was incidental because the first construction of the human rights instruments was done without a meaningful participation of people in the global south. I don't need to remind you that at the time that the first instruments were constructed, the global south was very much a colonial possession of the global north. At the same time, this has changed. If we look at how human rights instruments have been developed, increasingly, we see that they are becoming more and more porous to the diversity of human beings. We only need to look at the last instrument, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, to see that it's one of the few instruments that made a genuine attempt at participation to include drafters and key informants from the global south. It's not only to do with the making of the treaty itself, it is also to do with the normative construction of a treaty. We want to be assured that when we look at provisions in treaties, they are capable of responding to the diversity of human beings. I move now to the next point, which is intersectionality. And the point we are making is that a decolonial theory, which is intended to respond to coloniality, must at the same time be alive to intersectionalities. And I'm going to explain a little bit what intersectionality is about. Intersectionality itself has very diverse roots, but mainly it was, or it is a theory that came from Black feminists in the United States as they sought to critique Western feminism in its construction of the generic woman. And the point that was being made is that Western feminism at the time produced women as white, as middle class. And what the argument was that is we need to have a theory that captures the interlocking nature of disadvantages. It's not just sex, but it is also gender. It is also race. It is also disability. It is also sexuality. It is also nationality. So intersectionality, at its foundation, is an analytic method for ensuring inclusive equality. Why? Because it acknowledges that individuals and social groups are made up of more than a single subjectivities. Thus, we have multiple layers of subordination. And these multiple layers, they are also interlocking. So what intersectionality does is to caution us against operationalizing a single axis, a single approach to coloniality. What it does is to highlight that responding to coloniality requires turning away from prescribing a universal decolonial theory, which says the same for all people. So we need to move away from totalizing abstract decolonial theory in favor of a theory which responds to the concrete, to the particular, to the location. Because whilst in the global north, you might be thinking of racial minorities. In the global south, you may be thinking about social groups that have been dispossessed, their lands have been taken away, and this becomes a barrier to recognizing or achieving their economic dependence. So the location itself will allow us to think more concretely about coloniality and what would be the apt decolonial theory to contest coloniality. So intersectionality, just to summarize, tells us that Africans come in different shapes and sizes. They're not always the same. They are made up of a diversity of social groups. So we should not develop a decolonial theory that requires conformity, that imagines Africans as always the same, with the same aspirations and with the same needs. What I want to do now in this very last part is then to say, what would be the implications for decolonizing sexual and reproductive health and rights? So what I want to say is that this is what we want to think about as a way forward. We want to ask the question, if we look at healthcare law and policy, if we look at domestic law and policy, if we look at bilateral agreements, if we look at global agreements, is there something that decolonization can tell us about promoting the sexual and reproductive health and rights of Africans? Has a decolonial theory, or is a decolonial theory useful for thinking about access to safe abortion? When we look at the historical development of domestic law, as well as international law, we see clearly the origins of the regulation of abortion as steeped in coloniality. These were laws imported from one part of the world to another part of the world. The ecclesiastical rationale in abortion laws sought to protect the spiritualities or religiosities of the global north. So it really can't be contested that these laws have a colonial origin. Equally, if we look at sexual minorities and their aspirations, if we look at the barriers against recognition of sexual identities, against recognition of gender identities, clearly we see the fingerprint of coloniality in the construction of what is a normative sexuality in the construction of what is a normative gender. So the point I am making is that decolonial theory is useful. It's not a complete answer, but it is an important concept when thinking about deconstructing the subordination of gender minorities, the subordination of sexual minorities, the subordination of women who are seeking access to safe abortion. When we look at the global gag rule, for example, that prevents NGOs in the African continent and elsewhere from using funding provided by the United States, using it to promote, as it is described, to promote access to abortion. When we see those restrictions, certainly we see the fingerprint of coloniality. So the point I am making is that this is a useful exercise for us as Africans, but at the same time, we need to concede that it's never a complete answer. Theory does not stand on its own. It stands in conjunction with what our social groups are thinking, with what civil society is thinking, with what our policymakers are thinking, our lawmakers are thinking, with how the courts decide the cases before them. So I will stop now and allow the moderator to take the discussion forward.
Wow, thank you so much, Professor Ngwena. You have really taken us into what it means to decolonize Srhr. And I will immediately move to call on Dr. Maria to discuss the keynote. Dr. Maria is a senior lecturer at Makerere University, and she really has a lot of interest in governance, in organizational development and human rights, and mainly focuses on women and children's rights and civil society. So I'll call on Dr. Maria Nassali to discuss for us what Professor Ngwena has just provided to us. Over to you, Dr. Maria. Dr. Maria? Dr. Maria, are you there? You're still muted. Okay, just give me a minute and I see where Dr. Maria is. If she can be muted.
Yes. Good afternoon.
Shall we kindly request that somebody else near you gets muted? Okay. All right, over to you, Dr. Maria. Thank you. Okay, just a minute. I think somebody else has just a glitch. She's trying to unmute. Okay, I think we are good. We are good.
Okay, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Dr. Maria.
Yes,
please, we can.
You can put the video. First and foremost, I would like to thank Professor Ngwena for lending your name to the sexual reproductive and health rights movement, not as a male champion, but in the spirit of sisterhood. My encounter with you was when you're working with IPAS and you would call us in Nairobi to discuss the controversial issue of safe abortions and unwanted pregnancy. And in all that encounter, you have been a good human being. And I think for me, when we talk about decolonization or the concept of coloniality, we're really asking people at whatever levels they are, be it in the global north and the global south, be it in the private and in the public, be it in the powerful economic sector and the impoverished majority, is to always remember that people are human beings and they too desire to be treated the way that one would like to be treated. It's in the concept of good neighborliness. So I thank you for that, for having the courage to associate yourself with the weaker sex, because we all know that Srhr affects women more disproportionately than men. And it is a highly politicized, and that's where the contradiction is, and yet private matter. And its politicization continues in terms of controlling women's choices about sexuality and bodily autonomy. So the whole concept of challenging unequal power dynamics becomes important. I know in the paper you say it's about policymakers. And I think it's important to remind policymakers of the importance of governance in the best interest of all, particularly those who are the weakest in society. What the hurts is that it is not a matter of them and us when we're talking about feminism. It is a matter of accepting that power affects the utilization of resources and the making of choices, and also the documentation of people's lives. What is important? Those with power would choose what is important, and they will always set the agenda. So in the point, I would like to also thank you for acknowledging the role of feminism in your paper, that there's a lot that could be learned from the feminist discourse. And also, it cautions us that when we're talking about decolonizing reproductive and health rights, not everybody will be for the change, because the change is unsettling. People find it easier to continue with what is easy and what is established practice. So we're going to be pitting ourselves against an established manner of doing things. Even within the women's movement, we learned that there are women who have progressed, but found it easier to align themselves with the dominant discourse, because people work from best interests people will put the social majoritarian oppressive practices, because they also have to think about their voters. And they would tell you that my voters do not want anything that would challenge the status quo. So again, the concept of decolonizing sexual and reproductive rights have to be mindful that even in the global south, there will be people who are more comfortable with continuing the status quo. And that, in some, it is challenging, but it's also critical that we challenge inequality and promote equity in all private and public relations. It's not only the global north that we'll be dealing with, but as you said in your paper, that there are dominant concepts of capitalism and the dominant concept of religious fundamentalism. And therefore, we need to be aware of the mountain that we're about to climb. It takes a David and Goliath kind of trust, but also deep faith that one is doing the right thing, and if consistently done, then change can happen. So I move on to the next point, that the whole discourse of human rights. Rightly, human rights originated as a concept from the North. The majority of Africans were still under colonial rule at the time of making the major instruments. However, human rights, as you rightly say in your paper, provides a bulk, a wall, a defense between the people and the state. It's as a normative framework, therefore, it becomes important to constrain power by any actor and in any sphere. So human rights, therefore, lie at the intersection of power and powerlessness. And it also raises the issue of multiple identities. So, as a woman, for example, single mother, daughter, granddaughter, friend, neighbor, lover, lecturer, there are different dimensions of discrimination and equity questions that one has to negotiate at all those different layers that are embedded in one being. So, therefore, even within the state, I was trying to set the agenda for decolonization. There will be certain points where the different competing interests within a particular policy-making organ or within different policy organs, agencies would compete. For example, we must be mindful that what the executive may find important as policymakers, the judiciary may find maybe of less importance as judicial power, the parliamentarians may find as also different. So between the policymakers, one, there would be different competing interests, and those have to be negotiated without sacrificing the agenda. The case study of Uganda in 2021, the sexual offenses bill that never became law, thank God, but mostly with the intervention of the partners in the South that were able to convince the powers that actually it was against a globally defined agenda. And I like the caution that you give us, that it's not a matter, we shouldn't take a blind concept of what decolonizing means. Sometimes we may find allies in the South, as was in the case of the sexual offenses bill. We do know that cultural, religious, and political fundamentalism gave us a bill that was more retrogressive than the landmark jurisprudence that the judiciary had offered us. And most of the articles or the sections the judiciary had adjudicated on and found as unconstitutional. But then Parliament saw it upon itself in the spirit of social harmony to bring back the same acts, the same violations that had been declared unconstitutional. So probably we then need to look at how sexual and reproductive health rights manifest themselves in practice. Followed with that, I want to borrow from the concept of Ubuntu. Her Royal Highness Nabagarika Sylvia Najindaruswata, the Queen of Buganda, has revitalized the concept of Ubuntu Bulamu. What in most African states is called Ubuntu. I am because you are. We need to protect the weakest amongst us. And therefore, it calls upon values of good neighborliness, of mutual dignity, of respect, of tolerance. And working through that concept, we can find ways in which we can expand a common value that would deliver us a modicum of common basis upon which we can move together collectively. Luckily, and rather inadvertently, the COVID-19 pandemic reminded us that indeed we are community. We survived basically because the community was there to help, maybe with food, sharing local herbs, just also being there. But also, it unleashed a level of depression because people actually miss the community. It is amazing at the university, we found more interest of students attending lectures because they miss that social network. They miss to see their friends, to just talk. And therefore, that sense of community that when it is absent because we were locked up in our houses, the community enabled us to survive at various levels and with various levels of success. So the issue that you talked about, the abortion, reading your paper, you actually say that we took even the Maputo Protocol also took a state-centric approach, but also subjected women's enjoyment rights to a level of choice that is almost inhumane, that you have to prove that your life is in danger, or you have to prove that there was incest, forgetting that the victim at that point in time is also a human being. And as a human being, people think. And because people think, that human being is best placed to recognize, particularly in the first trimester, that this pregnancy is not a choice for me. What is more disconcerting is that the burden is shared exclusively by the woman. A man has no consequences of his sexual philandering. In fact, he may even be celebrated as being very macho, a conqueror of women and their bodies. What then that brings to mind is a conversation that I had with a legal officer at FIDA Uganda that offers legal aid to indigent women. First of all, as feminists, and many times before the 1995 Constitution, it was not uhuru for us. Sex was not a ground of acknowledged discrimination. We were comforted in law school that he included she, and therefore the woman was a legal object, was a possession of a man, as the man was a social owner, a physical and legal protector. A majority of women got legal redress through men, either as fathers, as husbands. And the stories, allow me to just recite two of them. One, Harriet Nabankema told me that the one lesson that she learned was never to ask a woman what happened in terms of unintended pregnancies. What I need to also emphasize to the audience is that most of the women that became pregnant were not socially recognized wives. They were not even cohabitees. Because if you're a cohabitee, socially, the community would recognize you as a wife. It doesn't matter whether you're married or not. Often these women were accidental sexual encounters. All women who became pregnant, not out of choice, but economic survival. One was a guard. The woman got pregnant. We managed to negotiate for her, as FIDA managed to negotiate for her, $20 a month to maintain a child. She came back the next year when she was pregnant by the same man, and the man said, I'm unable to increase the maintenance. I can only add maybe $2 or $5. So she had another pregnancy because she was trying to seek maintenance for her baby. Now she had 2 babies, and probably if she went back for the maintenance of the 2 babies, she will beget a 3rd one. The other one demystifies the concept of economic dependency. A well-to-do client drove to FIDA Uganda. The man said he was a staunch Catholic. And at that point in time, the one sexual encounter that he had worn a condom. And therefore, that could not have been his child. He kept on referring to the woman as your client. And in disgust, he said, please do not ever contact me. I will look after your child through this association. So the burden of unintended pregnancies squarely falls on women who are invisible sexual partners. Because when we're talking about abortion, many people say, but my wife is going to abort. They're forgetting that those are the most protected women in that discourse. The women that we're talking of are women who are not socially, legally recognized, but beget children. And some of them are incestuous relationships. Therefore, they are abominable, and the woman would have to, and the child too, would have to bear the brunt. So how do we move on? I know that you've talked about diversity and dynamism and new learning. And I'm glad to report that there's been some progress. And I think the judiciary in Uganda has done a commendable job in looking at an institution. Notice they haven't yet institutionalized, but at least they're experimenting with victim-centered approaches to sexual reproductive rights. Because we know that the criminal justice system, most of sexual reproductive rights are criminalized. And the criminal justice system is more in tune in protecting the rights of the accused, who are most often men. And therefore, the victims get to the court as a witness, as an object, despite the fact that actually she is the one who has shared the pain and the suffering. And the law is very adversarial, so that the victim stories get interjected, fragmented, and incorporated in a manner that seeks to either prove the accused as innocent or guilty. In such a situation, the victims get dehumanized. And therefore, and particularly to protect the presumption of innocence of the accused person. So treated as objects within a criminal justice system that offers them almost nothing. No compensation, no after court interface, but I know South Africa has done a lot in having a holistic approach and coordinated approach to victims of Srhr, and there's a lot to learn from. Therefore, we need to reconceptualize, and the biggest resistance is going to come from the law. How we as lawyers are more attuned to adversarial litigation and have to embrace the concept of restorative and retributive justice. And I like the fact that, unfortunately you had a few minutes, you do mention about that in your paper, and I found it very powerful. And I want to borrow from the Victims' Declaration that provided that restorative justice is a new term for an old concept. Throughout history of humankind, restorative justice approaches have been used in order to solve conflicts between parties and to restore peace in the community. And therefore, what we have to realize is that both the victim and the accused and the community have a role in uniting social bonds and also preventing future victimization. So justice in the sexual and reproductive health rights then manifests itself at three levels: the individual level, acknowledging the wrong and the person of wrongdoing and personal harm. Local level, putting the resources required for holistic healing for both the victim, the accused, and the society. Society level to get to do something to prevent the violence and the violation of human rights from occurring. So I like, because it's a story, Srhr, it's a very, very sad story. I like to use the image of a tango because I believe that it is important that we are not pitted against each other. It is important that both men and women participate in an enjoyable experience of social interaction to bring a multitude of people together to celebrate human interaction that protects all human beings in that interactions. Means, like you say, they will not, it's a case of many stories. It means that we must learn and document, learn with the community and document how they're dealing with these issues, because there's a disconnect between the highly litigation frameworks and the social mechanisms that the community have put inside. That's not to say that the communities are better off, no, because they also manifest the unequal power imbalance in society. Therefore, as in a tango, the decolonizing movement will not be linear, will not be singular, it will sway. At one point in time, we'll get our feet off the ground. At one point in time, either party may be vulnerable, but then the dance dramatically continues. Rather than get preoccupied, who should lead the tango? It is pragmatic to nurture trust, to enable anybody with a meaningful contribution, make it, so long as they add value to the rhythm of the tango. To paraphrase of a woman, there are no mistakes in a tango. Not like life, simple. If you make a mistake and get tangled up, just tango on. I thank you.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Maria. Reminds me of the fact that we have 2 days to begin the 16 days of activism around gender-based violence, and I find the conversation extremely important for the next 16 days. So I want to appreciate you for taking us into specific conversations about Uganda as a country, but also about how we can proceed to see how we decolonize, and then specific recommendations into what we have to do. So allow me get into the respondents to the conversation, and I'll start off with Dr. Mildred. Dr. Mildred is the country director of Srhr Africa Trust, and she comes in from Zimbabwe. So I feel like we've had a lot of experience from Uganda, and I hope that Dr. Mildred will also share a hint of really what happens in Zimbabwe. Over to you, Dr. Mildred.
Thank you so much, Madam Moderator. Let me also just say thank you very much for this timely discussion on decolonizing Srhr. I think too often when we hear of decolonizing, it is in the context of land or education curriculum. So it is refreshing that we can talk about decolonizing Srhr. And when we talk about Srhr, we are talking about the the physical, emotional, mental, and social well-being in relation to all aspects of sexuality and reproduction, dysfunction or infirmity, not just the absence of disease, dysfunction or infirmity. And when we look at what colonization has done, it takes away these enjoyments. Srhr is an epitome of the fundamental human rights critical to the fulfillment of women's rights. And we need to talk about this in the context of bodily autonomy, integrity, and reproductive choices. So decolonization is critical, timely, and relevant, and provides us with a comprehensive understanding of the multiverse of the humanity of Africans in fully appreciating Srhr, especially for the African woman. Let me therefore say to Prof. Charles, thank you very much for the apt description and definition of decolonizing. So I won't dwell on that. What, however, is important from my view, from your description of this decolonization, is that it is not an event. I like the fact that we are talking about decolonizing Srhr today, but the issues for tomorrow may be different. So that recognition, we need to be perennially aware of the importance of continuous discussion around decolonizing Srhr. I will base my responses to response to the paper on 4 aspects. The first one is the influence of patriarchy on decolonizing Srhr. You talked about abortion, and my immediate predecessor has already also alluded to issues of abortion. And I think it's one of the most obvious issues related to decolonizing Srhr. You rightly point out that abortion was a very private issue before colonization, and it should still be a private issue. But we know the way in which former colonies, colonialists rather, influenced the development of laws to regulate women's bodies. And what patriarchy has done is just to perpetuate that. So patriarchy is also a form of colonization of women's bodies, where men want to have control over what a woman can or cannot do with her body. So bodily agency is impeded when we talk about abortion and the right to a woman's choice to have an abortion. I can give examples of instances where women have been taunted for wearing what is comfortable to them because a particular group of society feels they should wear otherwise. So if I go back to the example of abortion, a month ago, I sat in a room, in a conference room with OBS and gynecologists, and all due respect to all of them. And we had over 80% of men discussing and agreeing that women should not be having abortions. So this was an Africa conference of obstetricians and gynecologists seated in Victoria Falls, and I had an opportunity to talk about some of the issues related to Srhr and abortion. 80% of the medical practitioners in that room were men. So this is a very patriarchal approach to women's bodily autonomy based on a very colonial influence, and it's made of colonized opinions. So we still have instances where women's bodily autonomy is not guaranteed in the context of the medical professionals because of the laws that we have. We've already heard of the instances similar to Uganda. Zimbabwe you can only have an abortion under 3 conditions, which is incest, rape, or the health of the unborn child or the fetus or the mother. So that takes away a woman's right to make decisions over her body. It takes away her bodily autonomy. Then the next point that I want to speak to is about the religious and cultural practices as agents of colonizing Srhr, but also as the possible conduits for decolonizing Srhr. And you do allude to the religious and cultural factors in your paper. So a huge influence of colonization was through the introduction of religion, and of course, the transformation of our cultural practices. So in using religion as a form of colonizing SRHR, I again refer to women's autonomy with reference to accessing services such as contraceptives. Some religions don't allow women to use contraceptives. Now, without contraception and where sex happens, pregnancy will happen. So this takes away the woman's right to determine the number of children she will have, and patriarchal attitudes will frown on a man having a vasectomy. I've interacted with men who have said, you know what, I'm not a medical practitioner, but medical reading will tell me that it is so much easier for a man to have a vasectomy as a form of birth control. But our patriarchal perceptions will be, if a man has a vasectomy, it takes away his manhood. It takes away who he is as the authority. Then the third point that I want to bring to the table is colonization of women's bodies through gender-based violence. We've already talked about how abortion was a private issue, but it's now been made a very public issue where women's bodies are battleground for rape, incest, female genital mutilation, and a whole lot of other harmful cultural practices, depending on which part of Africa you are. So GBV is mostly men on women, and 1 in 3 women have experienced GBV of some form in their lives. The human rights approach, which has been used in understanding SRHR, falls short in appreciating the dynamic context in which the African humanity stems from given the diversity, needs, and ideologies that are central to the well-being of an African woman or girl child. And this is critical for reflection as clearly articulated in the paper and the discussion. So patriarchy continues to play a key role in the colonization of women's SRHR through GBV. Because a man feels they have paid a bride price, they can abuse a woman, they dictate how many children the woman should bear, and they dictate when sex should happen or when it should not happen, even when a man might be infected with an STI. So again, GBV, patriarchy, all being forms of colonizing SRHR. And then the fourth point that I want to bring to the table has to do with the language. And when I look at language, language does matter. Today we are on this webinar and talking about decolonizing SRHR. I can assure you, not everyone is comfortable with the term SRHR. It behoves us to interrogate a whole lot of intersectionalities, some of which I've referred to around GBV, patriarchy, and bodily autonomy. I've had opportunity to participate in various conferences on the Commission on the Status of Women, where negotiations are made, and Africa has tried to ensure that the SRHR language takes into consideration the context of Africa. Now, this is a group of experts coming together to talk about what it is that should inform the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. So this is always a huge feat, when you're trying to negotiate what language should go into the agreed conclusions of the paper each year. And because there are countries which have bigger powers, they will agitate and advocate for language which is not necessarily Afrocentric, but because they have power, because they have resources, they can mobilize for opposition to the language that would be most suited to Africa. So language does matter as we try to decolonize SRHR. So today, reviewing laws and policies on access to SRHR services is a hard nut to crack in the African context. given the failure to address the right language to put forward in advancing the concerned policy changes needed. I'll also give an example of the context that we have in Zimbabwe, where our SRHR policies and laws are so fragmented and at times contradictory. So you have in one instance, the age of consent to health services being different from the age of consent to sex. What that simply means is we have women and girls having sex on the one hand, and we have a law which says that you cannot access reproductive health services because of your age. So those contradictions speak to the laws, speak to the policies, which are not always in tandem or are conducive to the protection of, or rather to promoting women's access to SRHR services, which in a way perpetuates the colonization of SRHR. So decolonizing SRHR means pushing forward the right language that addresses the context and needs with lived experiences that express the African humanity over the human rights arguments, which is considered foreign and not relevant in the African culture. And from my context in conversations with policymakers, when we tried to speak to issues of policy, we understand the needs language and not so much the rights language. If we talk about the rights to abortion in the communities in which I've worked, there will be a backlash. But if I talk about the number of young girls becoming pregnant due to limited access to contraceptives and then dying from unsafe abortions, it becomes easier to introduce the subject of SRHR, the subject of protecting women and girls against unsafe abortions, and in so doing, opening the doors and avenues for them to access SRHR services, including contraceptives and including safe abortions. So in conclusion, I want to say I agree entirely that decolonizing SRHR is not a once-off. It is a continuous process to which SRHR actors need to be continuously aware so that the gains that have been made by one generation, and I know we can talk about several gains that we have made. The fact that we're talking about it today, it's a huge gain. The fact that we have our members of parliament talking about abortion is a huge gain. So we want to ensure that we don't lose these gains through the inaction of one generation. So thank you very much, Prof. Charles, for your paper, which I thoroughly enjoyed reading, especially as we are getting into the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence and the International Human Rights Day. The various instruments that you cited, such as the Maputo Protocol, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, are all important starting points for decolonizing SRHR. But as you rightly and aptly put it, decolonization is not a once-off. And we need to continuously interrogate these international conventions and protocols to ensure that the language that we want as Africa is what is contained. And the experiences that we have as Africa is what goes into these protocols. So we need to be at the table when these discussions are being held. So decolonizing SRHR cannot be complete without women's empowerment, the enjoyment of bodily autonomy and social justice. Patrick Wolf in the 1990s, when he was talking about colonialism and settler colonies, said, invasion is, colonization is invasive. Invasion is a structure, not an event. Hence, dismantling and decolonizing SRHR will not be an event, but a process, because the structure of colonizing SRHR is firmly set. So we need to dismantle that structure. It doesn't happen over a day. It doesn't happen over some policies. Our ancestors went to war to fight for land. And like I said earlier on, when we've talked about colonization in the past, we've always we generally tend to think about land. So when our ancestors went to war to fight for land that had been taken by colonialists, it took armed struggles, bloody wars, because the colonial power was not going to hand over the land on a silver platter. They knew it was a very precious and finite resource. So likewise, decolonizing SRHR will not happen without a struggle against patriarchy, repressive religious and harmful cultural practices. It will have to be fought not with guns and guerrilla warfare tactics, as our ancestors did when they fought for our freedom, but in the corridors of negotiations, for language, action, and of course with the meaningful participation of women. And Professor Charles, you talked a lot about the inclusiveness of whatever processes we engage in as we decolonize, and I liked that. So it is important that we have the meaningful participation of women and those that can make a difference and contribute to the discourse of decolonizing SRHR. So the discourse of decolonizing SRHR offers us a powerful tool for interrogating positions of power, of patriarchy, and dominant cultures and religion. Adopting the whole of enclave approach is critical in appreciating the diversity of the African humanity, as it provides a holistic perspective to experiences and lived realities, especially for African women. And here I think of things like unpaid care work, gendered roles and responsibilities, poverty, abuse, exploitation, and subjugation from patriarchy. So we need to bring the SRHR discussion to the African context, where we look at these issues that impact on the African woman. So engaging this approach, in my view, is critical in shaping the SRHR discourse as it accommodates the realities of being African and the challenges that are faced daily. We need to continuously—
I'm sorry, Dr. Mildred, you may have to summarize.
Okay, I'm done. So we need to continuously challenge the prescriptive approaches of a one-size-fits-all to policymaking, to protocols and conventions, which fail to consider the African context and its diversities. So thank you very much once again, Madam Moderator. I will end here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mildred. I love the fact that you speak to language as one issue that is colonized and needs to be decolonized. It's surprising that in Uganda, even speaking about comprehensive sexuality education, while adding that S, the C, is a challenge for us. And I think for me, language is key as we speak about decolonization. So we want to appreciate you so much for creating time for us. Allow me call on Mr. Maleche Alan. Mr. Maleche is the Executive Director of Kenya Legal and Issues and Ethical Issues Network on HIV and AIDS, and he will as well delve into responding to the discussion that has been provided to us by both Dr. Nasali and Professor Ngwena. So Mr. Maleche, I want to hand over to you.
Thank you. I will take the briefest time possible, not because I lack content, but because I want to also have a chance to hear questions and comments from others. So I'll only build to what the Professor Ngwena has spoken to, what Dr. Nasalia has contributed to, and what Dr. Mushunje has contributed to. And I want to raise 4 quick issues. The first one is, I am never in a different path or course of thought when we come to issues of SRHR and Professor Ngwena. I can only add a little bit to the wisdom he has already shared, and I'll begin by saying that the one thing he has done in his paper that is important and is critical for this conversation, is having a shared understanding of what we mean by the term decolonization. And to have that shared understanding, we have to start by understanding the history of why are things the way they are now, what were they in the past, how did they inform our decision. One thing that has always been a problem for us in the health movement, in the SRHR movement, but generally even in the development movement, is failing to take into account what was the history. And when I talk about the history, it's not what has been written for us, but it's going deeper to understand what exactly it is and understanding how those historical aspects informed decision making at that time, how they have changed over time, and more recently, how they are coming back to be replayed, because some of the things that are happening in the world of SRHR are clearly a replication of things that happened way back during colonial times. For instance, how would you explain Kenya, a country that has a constitution that allows for the right to health, reproductive health, abortion is permitted under certain circumstances, international instruments are binding to Kenya, but we happily sign on to a Geneva Consensus Declaration in the year of 2021, regressing all the rights we have made, knowing well science, evidence, and human rights exist. How do we have our minds of our leaders so colonized or influenced in a way that they don't even realize the progress that we've made? They are ready to cede it because they're either driven by religious influences, pressure from donor countries, pressure from other deals, or pressure from their constituents. So how do we try to understand what informs the decisions that we do and how we move forward? So documenting that history is very important, and I think the paper Professor Ngwena has put forward does that well, and I think that's what our starting point should be, to understand these issues. I think the second issue for me is, and I do agree with Professor Ngwena, that we are not all the same in Africa. We come in different colors, shapes, and sizes, and different practices, and that is something that has to be taken into account as you advance this particular discourse, that no one size fits all. And so how do you ensure that we tailor make this conversation to the needs, not even of countries, but of different communities and different individuals? And on that point, I just want to emphasize that we must remember that when we speak about sexual health and rights, we always, in most cases and in most conversations, people don't pay much attention to the sexual health part of it, which is something that's critical. The ability of one to enjoy mutually fulfilling sexual relationships, your freedom from sexual abuse, as has been discussed earlier, coercion or harassment, or even safety from sexually transmitted diseases are things that we don't emphasize critically. When we're speaking about SRHR, we do focus more on the medical bit, the access to medicines, the issues of abortion, but I think we need to look at it comprehensively and see what are we actually addressing and what are the concerns that you're trying to face. Is it only abortion? Is it issues of sterilization? Is it issues of FGM? Is it issues of infertility? Is it issues of assisted reproductive technology? What exactly is it we're trying to address in SRHR, and how do we go about it in a systematic way, taking into account the needs and the challenges of the communities or the people who are largely affected? And still linked to this conversation, and I saw a question in the chat about what does this mean for the male child. I think it's important to appreciate that reproductive health is a component of health that is both important for men and women, but it's more critical for women because of the major burden of disease that women face with the reproductive role that they play and the potential that they have. And so we must appreciate that as much as there'll be voices of saying what's the boy child doing, what's happening with men, we must appreciate and be cognizant of the fact that the larger burden falls on women, and human rights has taught us you focus on the person who is most affected by the burden, and that's the person you give priority in what you're doing. So again, we need to think through around that burden that it faces women in their different facets. And coming back to the issue I talked about in terms of history, I want to bring in a practical issue that arose with a decision of the African Commission that was just communicated a few days ago from their last hearing, where they chose not to, or rather they rejected, this was during their final communique of their 73rd ordinary session, they actually rejected to have 3 NGOs admitted to the observer status on the grounds that those NGOs were dealing with issues of sexual orientation or working on issues relating to LGBTI community, and that the African Charter, this was contrary to the values of the African Charter, which does not envision issues of LGBTI and sexual orientation. And then that comes to play in the light of Professor Ngwena's paper. As much as we want to keep our quote unquote African culture or African values, to what extent are they violating rights that have been agreed upon? And to what extent do we tolerate our African values with regards to this particular conversation? Because there are some values and practices that are definitely detrimental. Coming to my second last point then comes to the change of the mindsets, because for many of these things to happen, you need decision makers and even the community to have a change in mindset. What kind of investments are we making to change those mindsets? Are we training lawyers differently? I know Isla from South Africa is trying to do that in terms of creating a broad network of feminist lawyers who understand and litigate from a feminist perspective. Do we have similar programs for judges? Do we have similar programs for parliamentarians? Do we have movement building that's driving towards that? Because when you don't change the mindset, it does not matter how many laws and judgments that you get, you will still get the same pushback. And that has been partly the experience of South Africa with their LGBTI laws, with their abortion laws, that you could have them on paper, courts could decide upon them, but if society is still frowning on these issues and doesn't appreciate what needs to happen, then that again becomes problematic. Then my last point is to mention the fact that how then do we get to document and use the evidence of the good practices that are driving SRHR in the right direction from the continent to inform the decision making at a country level, at a regional level, and at a global level? How do we get this evidence into those spaces so that our narrative can now be documented in this diverse world where people highly rely on published papers, scholarly articles? How do we do that? I think the conversation, as was said by Dr. Musunje, is not an event, it's a process, and it's one that has to begin on the right footing. And just to finally end by recognizing Professor Ben's question in the chat around access to contraceptives, and I think my answer to your question, Professor Ben, in terms of should we be addressing the issue of access to contraceptives to women in rural areas, or should we be addressing the poverty issue? I think generally we need to look at reproductive health not only from a health issue, but also from a development issue, because failing to access contraceptives may have a negative effect on you getting unwanted pregnancy, losing out on your productivity, losing out on career growth and aspects of that. So my quick answer to you is to look at aspects from a holistic approach and not only look at reproductive health or access to contraceptive from an isolated place, because there are interconnections to health, reproductive health, and other developmental issues and even governance issues that we need to take into account. And I think that's the approach we need to be striving towards. So back to you, Madam Chair. Looking forward to more interactions with the panelists on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Alan. And I really want to appreciate all the panelists today. I kindly request that you pose the questions in the Q&A and that our panelists can actually respond to the questions immediately. One thing that I picked from you, Alan, is the need to document. And I think it's important that we appreciate the contribution of Afya and Ahaki for having worked with Professor Charles to have such a paper that we are actually discussing today. Perhaps it's the beginning of so many documentations that we may need to use later as evidence to advance conversations in the area. So I want to appreciate you team from Ahaki for leading us into this conversation. And lastly, allow me to invite the last respondent, Mr. Rumi, who is the president of Lawyers Alert in Nigeria, and an international development expert with over 10 years of experience providing capacity building, strategic direction, and managing programs and coalitions of civil society organizations in the field of human rights. So we'll listen to him, and then we'll later open up for a conversation. I already see people having hands up. Kindly hold on for the next 10 minutes, and then we'll open up for conversation. Over to you, Romeo.
Thank you so very much, Madam Chair. I will actually take less than 10 minutes so we could have the persons in the room make enough inputs. And I want to thank Prof for a very well research paper. I think, like Alan said, it provides us very informed conversations on the issues around colonization and decolonization of Srhr in Africa. As I read the paper, one thing became very clear to me, and I kept on wondering, and I think it's a basis for reflection here, that the national charters, they seem not to have the input, so to speak, of Africans at the time, because we were colonized and all of that. You begin to reflect, what about the risks, and what about even the ones that we are putting together in Africa, whether at sub-regional level or at regional levels? They, in terms of speaking to the gaps that Prof mentioned. I think for me, this is a very important basis to think whether or not we are making progress, even when these things are being done by Africans and for Africa. It's been established in the course of this conversation that we are a diverse persons in Africa, and vulnerabilities still exist, whether of the sexual minorities, whether of women, and all of that. And so when we make these charters in terms of democratizing them, are the voices of these persons captured well enough into what we do in Africa for Africa and for Africans? Because we can't make a lot of gains in terms of saying, look, because we have the chance to look at what went wrong in the past, like Alan was saying, then what we do now should speak to the gaps that we've noticed. So the persons living with disability, or the persons with disabilities, or women, or the LGBTI groups and all of that, how does the African Charter capture their voices in truth that speaks to issues of accommodating differences and all of that? And I think for me, this is the first thing I want to say, that we should reflect on the paper, research paper that Prof delivered, and look at whether or not in today's terms, we are also abiding what we, when we pass the level. Secondly, for me, would be this issue of awareness, which Ellen touched on. When we speak to issues of safety to ourselves, or are we speaking and no? Are we the fact that colonialism
you seem to be breaking a lot. We're missing a lot of the conversation from you.
Must have been my network then. Am I clearer now?
Yes, please. Thank you. I think what we need to do is you could put off the video such that you only use audio to kind of reduce the breakage. Yeah, thank you.
works, it helps now. Yes, so saying that awareness is also critical. Colonialism has done a lot in African. So it's not out of place for us to say, for example, that issues of LGBT are alien to Africans. It's not out of place for us to say abortion or right to safe abortion is alien to the person on the street, to that average person. These are all the relics of colonialism, as it were. When we speak in terms of trying to deconstruct these issues, do we talk to persons who should hear and learn? Because except the communities and except the policymakers also understand these things in the way they are supposed to be understood, we'll be taking calls to Newcastle. I'll give you two examples. In Nigeria, for instance, Lagos State and Imo State, two states in Nigeria, passed some regulations at executive levels that advance, say, Imo, for example, the people, the communities rose against these regulations, or against the law, as it were, and it has to be struck down immediately. They said, no, they can't allow abortion or safe abortion as well. The same in Lagos. Ahead of ourselves in trying to see that, the issues of abortion or safe abortion is permitted beyond what we see at international covenants that are not domesticated. Let's domesticate it in local laws and all of that. But the same people is what meant for rebelled in court against it, and it has to be taken down. So the issue of trying to educate critical if we are to make the gains against what's colonial of Srhr in. Second example I give you is the LGBTI laws in Nigeria, which the Same-Sex Marriage Prohibition Act in Nigeria. That law expressly criminalizes same-sex conduct. That law criminalizes even advocating for same-sex relationships and all of that. It makes it, it says people can go to jail for 14 years. Never mind that we're dealing with terrorism, we're dealing with all big things in Nigeria, but that is where we are channeling our efforts. And the communities are largely in support of these laws. I'll tell you why, because we have consistently rehashed the line that issues of same-sex relationships is Western. But if you read Prof's paper, it shows that these issues have always been, or Africa has always dealt with these issues in its own way. They have been with us. They are in our communities, even before colonialism and the white man came. But suddenly they are anti-African values, and we need to speak against them. So for me, the issues of awareness, the issues of reflection on even the local laws and charters we're putting in, not addressing the gaps, are the two issues I would want to talk on in specifics, and to encourage that in terms of building, in terms of women taking charge of their bodies, as it were. Today, you cannot divorce that conversation away from socio-economic empowerment of the woman. And that is why we also need to steer the conversation along that lines. In Africa, in Nigeria, for example, I'll tell you that this has to do a lot with political power. So economic empowerment goes in tandem with political power. Because if you're not empowered either economically or politically, you can't leverage on the other. And that is why also opening that space for women, especially political space for women, is also critical if women are to truly take charge of their bodies and to also push for their rights, sexual and reproductive rights. So I will stop at that and hope that my network has allowed me at least in very literate terms that can be understood. Thank you so much, and over to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Mr. Momi. I think that the message to us is educating, among others, educating the girl child. And indeed, empowerment should be key if we really have to have conversations on decolonizing SRHR. I want to appreciate you so much and allow me open up for the next 5 minutes to our participants to pose any possible questions and areas of clarification to you. Also kindly get into the chat and respond to the questions that have been posed there as panelists. So I'll open up to participants now. I think I saw the hand of Ms. Namugera. Regina, I am not sure if that question is still on. Ms. Namugera, I saw your hand up. Okay. Okay, any questions for us? I will pose the question in the chat for now as we wait on to, okay. I think I have one hand up. Labira, you have a hand up. Please go ahead. Labira Msoke. Smaya. Labira, is your hand up for, maybe you forgot it up? Okay, I'll pose the question in the chat for now. There's a question by Professor Ben, and I know, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
But I would want to appreciate Professor Ngwena and the other colleagues, the respondents. Mine is a concern of acknowledging our privileges as we talk about the decolonial agenda and moving into that transformation. One, when he talks about inclusive equality, and I don't know how much the communities that we speak for often are represented in these spaces. And that is always the challenge that we conflict with, because we are also like entrenching the colonial aspects that we are trying to dismantle. So at what point are we intentional to bring also the communities into these spaces? Because at the end of the day, we shall be speaking to our own selves. That's my observation. Thank you.
Thank you, Labira. I'm not sure if any of the panelists want to respond to that. Let me first see if we have another hand up. Okay, I don't see any other hand up, but as any panelist tries to get to that question, allow me also read the question by Professor Ben, which he posted in the chat saying that over the years, it has been observed by various commentators that the contraceptive prevalence rate is low, especially among rural poor women. Why do such women have many children? Does the answer lie in enhancing access to and utilization of contraceptives, or the solution lies in tackling the systematic and structural causes of poverty in all its major dimensions? So I will call on the panelists to respond to the question, as well as the concern raised by Labira. Any of us wants to try?
I think we can take it in turn.
Please.
Professor Ngwena, please proceed.
I wanted to give you the opportunity first, Dr. Nasali.
Okay, it's a give and take. Thank you so much. One of the things that I want to caution us that there is nothing wrong with being an elite. It is good that we went to school and have progressed and maybe occupy positions of power and influence. What is important is that we use those spaces to advance a common good. I know the challenge of elitism is often levied against women when we speak out against the injustices. And we are often positioned as being contrary to what the majority woman wants. But then there are issues of power dynamics. So since we have escaped some of them, we have a moral duty to speak out to and influence the policymakers that often take action without hearing us. That is not to say that we thrive in marginalizing the communities that we work with. I think a number of us have worked with the communities and used these platforms to amplify their concerns. However, it is only organized people that can make change. This is the beginning of a conversation where we are developing a common understanding of what we want to achieve together. But the caution that Labere talks about is one that we bear in mind, and it's important that the spaces be voluminized and widened so that we can hear the diversity of opinions, particularly of those who are closest to the problem. The second one is that the contraceptive prevalence or availability is in itself a microsome of the power inequalities. Sometimes the contraceptives are actually available, but the women are unable to use them. And when they do, they are punished for being promiscuous. Why is it that you need to protect yourself from my pregnancy? And so they need to be a little bit more discreet. Many people, many women may not have the luxury of choice over bodily autonomy and whether or not to take a simple decision of using a contraceptive or not.
Thank you, Dr. Maria. I really appreciate your response. Professor Charles, would your response have been different? Do you want to add on to what she has said?
It would not have been different. Just to add on the first question about elitism, and the point is that we have historically two main theoretical approaches to democracy: representative democracy, where other people speak on your behalf. But the debate now is that representative democracy is not transformative. So we want participatory democracy, which is really what we spoke about when we talked about inclusive equality. However, participatory democracy assumes that you will create the structures for it. So I think what the speaker was saying was that there is a structure missing because there is no participation of those that you are speaking about. So I think that's a very important point, that as we think about participatory democracy more deeply, we think about the structures that we need to create. in order to make it a reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think it also depends on the definition of community. I'm one person that loves to define community, starting with myself. So I really want to appreciate you, and just to note that there's no other question or hand up. So I want to appreciate the participants as well as all of us for being here for the last 2 hours. And Professor Charles, if you may allow, can I kindly request you to close this webinar for us as a keynote addresser? Please support us in closing the webinar.
Well, thank you for the privilege. I don't think I have the wisdom to close the webinar as such, but mostly my summary is about thanking the participants, to thank those who took the trouble to convene the convention, the webinar in the first place, which is Ahaki. We thank you for the initiative. It's important that the papers are discussed publicly, as has happened today. So that's a very important contribution. It's important we archive what we discuss and we disseminate what we discuss. So we're very grateful. And personally, I'm very grateful to the respondents. I'm grateful for the wisdom of Dr. Nasali, Dr. Mushunge, my compatriot. I also am Zimbabwean, and I'm grateful to Alan Maleche, and I'm grateful to Romy Mom. I think all your comments went to adding to the debate, to acknowledging the complexity of decolonization, but also giving it practicality, taking us forward, suggesting how we can, in practice, create structures for it and resources for it. And I think Alan Maleche made a point about making sure that we align theory with practice. We speak to the constituencies that are involved in decolonization, even though they might not be aware, but he highlighted the futility of a debate that leaves out the stakeholders, because they will end up making the same decisions that they made the previous year, and nothing will change. So I think that's very important. And I think also what came out is that the debate itself of sexual and reproductive health and rights has tended to focus on abortion, but I wish to highlight that in this instance, abortion was merely an illustration, because the topics are diverse and they all need attention. So I'm very grateful that we managed to take the debate forward and not simply speak about the paper, but speak to how the paper intersects with the diversity of the sexual and reproductive health and rights field. So I would also like to thank participants who contributed through listening and also through submitting their questions. I think the questions that we heard about how participation has been thought about for this event was important. And there was a question about contraception, which talked about and which was answered very ably by Dr. Nasali, that in one sense, it may not be a question of resources, that the contraceptives themselves are available, but the structures, the patriarchal structure in which the contraceptives are provided makes it difficult for women to make a decision and implement their decision. But there could also be a question of availability of resources. So it's always a very complex response that you need to come up with in order to respond adequately to the full domain of sexual and reproductive health and rights. So thank you everyone for the trouble you took. to contribute to this important debate. And I'm very humbled by the comments that were advanced, and I have taken lessons from the suggestions that were made. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Ngwena. And this brings us to the end of this.
I should say thank you, moderator, so for your able moderation. It was excellent.
I am humbled. I am humbled. Thank you so much, and have a lovely evening, afternoon, morning.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Moderator.